Good morning, everybody. I hope that you're doing well this morning. Why don't we begin today, as we did, I believe, last time, inviting the Holy Spirit to have authority in this time to speak to us and through us, to pray through us, as we always do, and to effectively create change in us today. You can worship by song if you have a means of doing that. We continue to pray this week for the persecuted church in Sudan, especially for Muslim background believers who, under the laws of Sudan, can be legally put to death for converting to Christian faith, and anything else that comes to mind in that time. So why don't you pause now and pray. Okay, we're going to pause again with a question. This one's an interesting one, and if you've got kids with you, I'll be surprised if they can answer it, but maybe they can. There is one job, maybe you could show me more, but specifically one job that's given in the New Testament by Jesus to his church that has to be completed before he returns. His return is contingent on its completion. So, to put it in kids' words, what job did Jesus give the church to do that must be done before he returns? I wonder if you know that job. Go ahead and talk about that. Okay, so I want to read from Matthew 28 today. This will start to give away our answer. And then from Matthew 24. Matthew 28, verses 18 to 20, the Great Commission, of course. Then Jesus came to them, that's the 12 disciples, 11 at this point, and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always, even to the very end of the age." Now, this is called the Great Commission. It's the big job that Jesus gave to the church as it goes about the world, sometimes quite intentionally going out, and sometimes, like we see, I believe it's Acts chapter 8, not intending to go out with a mission at all, but being forced out through persecution. The Great Commission is one of the chief jobs of the church at this time. It's really worship and discipleship, which includes, under discipleship of people who've never heard before, of new nations, of all nations. Now, I want to read from Matthew 24 as well, verse 14, and some of you will know that Matthew 24 is all a chapter about end times. What will happen before Jesus returns? What will be going on? How can we identify that we're drawing close? Matthew 24, verse 14 says these interesting words. "And this gospel of the kingdom," Jesus says, "will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come." In other words, Jesus links his return to the preaching of the word to all nations. Now, we're going to get back to the state of affairs in the world in that job that the church has a little bit later. But what I want to talk about today, it's not really a traditional sermon. It's really a vision update. Our church has been working for a number of months, both our elders board and our missions committee, on a vision for where the Lord is leading us in the future with our missions endeavors. And so in other words, our purpose is beyond the church doors. How are we deliberate about that? Where is he wanting to grow? So I want to go over that with you and what we found there. And one of the first things that we found is that, just as I've read Matthew 28, Matthew 24, recovering local church responsibility for the Great Commission, for missionary activity across the globe. You know, the church doesn't help with global missions. Global missions is the domain of the church. The church doesn't help third-party sending organizations like YWAM or World Team or OMF or name what you want. You probably know dozens of them. Wycliffe, MIF, all of these. We don't help those organizations. They exist, and almost all of them will even have in their mission statements that they exist to facilitate the mission of the local church to reach all nations. That's our job. And so this isn't something you can outsource, as much as we love outsourcing not just our economy, but even our church jobs these days. to parachurch organizations or organizations outside the church walls. No, those exist to help the church do its job, because the job belongs to the church first. So it's not something that we help them with, it's something they help us with. And we're very grateful for partnerships like the ones that we have, because they can specialize and help us. And yet we must see that we are the ones responsible for this job that we call global missions and even local missions. And so our theme is that the purpose of global missions is to send from the local church to the local church. That is God's whole purpose in saving us. It does not just include making us right before God as individuals, but creating something, a body called the local church, in which we will grow and flourish. It's a society. We're social creatures meant to be with one another, not just directly to God. Salvation isn't just an individual affair. And so we fundamentally believe that the local church comes in all shapes and sizes, all different expressions, and almost all of them are valid. In fact, if it's truly fulfilling local church, it's valid. But having said that, we are a local church who sends to the local church. That means that when we send out a missionary to a place where Christianity is already established, we expect them to be helping the local church and advance the local church in that country. So for example, the word is spread throughout virtually all of Africa now, and churches are well established there. If we send someone to Africa, our purpose is not just for them to start their own ministry, it's for them to help the church in Africa to advance its ministry. We've been working for a long time as missions organizations from the West to hand over power to indigenous people to run their own indigenous church movement, in which we can power, in which we can have influence as well, which is fitting between free people. But we are proponents, heavy proponents of the local church. And that means wherever there is not a local church, and we're going to get to in a moment that there's lots of places there still isn't a really serious local church movement in this world, we are going there to establish a local church. That's our purpose, not just to save individuals. We want saved individuals to come together the way Christ has prescribed in a local church. So sending from the local church to the local church. That also means we need to take responsibility for our agents' needs. When we help a missionary, we are the senders. We are, even though legally in Canada we're usually not, we are theologically the employers of these individuals. They get their mandate from us. We are sending them. They represent us, and we're responsible for them. And that means we're responsible for them present and future. Now, there's all kinds of different philosophies on the level of comfort that a missionary should have on a mission field. And, for financial support alone, how do you go about doing that? Is it the maximal? Is it the minimal? And we work with organizations all over that. But we're going to have a philosophy of our own at our church, and it might change. I'll give you YWAM as an example. Their philosophy is get people out as fast as possible. And that means they don't do everything that every other organization does around establishing their financial means. Sometimes a YWAMer will do very well on their own, raising a great deal of support, and sometimes not so much. But the philosophy is get feet on the ground. I'm fine with that. But it's not the one that currently as a church we're following. We feel a real burden to show honor to those we send out by ensuring that we take care of them present and future, that they are well taken care of. And in the future, if they come back and join us, which most of them expect them to do, they can retire like anybody else from a career can retire. And so we make efforts towards that. That's our philosophy. And that means that we even encourage third-party senders that we send through what are often called sending organizations like YWAM, like World Team, like whoever. We encourage them to think about that and make a space for us to provide for our missionaries, okay? We want this to be something we negotiate with those we're in partnership with. Help us to reach our goals of our philosophy as well. More and more missions organizations like SIM, which is the biggest sender in Canada, are looking at a co-sending model where the church is a direct employer as well as the third-party sending organization, SIM, because they recognize, hey, there's just this gap between local church and the missionaries that they're supposed to have sent out. Let's bring that gap back together. Let's make sure they're directly under the fold of the local church. And that way also local church gets to make some decisions about how they care for and support the people they send out. Now, Ministry, I guess to summarize that, is not just about the project. In fact, ministry is ultimately about people. The project exists for people. The project is to help and save and disciple and grow people. So we have to make sure that we're treating people right, or the whole project is undermined. Because the project is not a product, it's not a profit margin, it's not any of those things, it's people. So we need to care for people. This also means we want to hold people accountable. You know, one of the things that's often undervalued is how important the missionary is to their support team, their financial and prayer support team, and how important that building that relationship is, not just so you can get the money to get to the field, but because we require our missionaries to help us see the world when we're in the local church. We need them to speak to us, to challenge us, to tell us what they've experienced, to tell us what God is doing in the world. We need them to disciple us. They're a part of our discipleship. And so building a financial and prayer support team is essential to the missionary job, because it's not just to reach out there, it's to continue feeding into the local church so it keeps understanding where it is in the mission and keeps inspiring to send out. And so we want to support no more than 20% of any of our missionaries' budgets, because we want to spread out the workload and the discipleship load across numerous people. And we also want to make sure that they are motivated to reach their goals that they negotiate financially with their third-party organization. So we want to make sure they're at least 80% of their full funding all the time. The 20-80 rule. We'll supply 20% at maximum, and you need to meet 80% of your financial goal. So the other thing we're working on is continuing on and growing in a personal relationship. We've been doing that for years. We have these support teams that are growing. We're getting better of communication, of sending gifts, of reporting back and forth, of making sure our local church hears reports of what's happening over there. And so we're growing in that as well. Relationship is so essential, and so often missionaries wonder, does anybody even remember me? And when they come back to Ascending Church, they step in that congregation, does anybody here know me? And we want to make sure the answer to both those questions is a resounding yes. And one other thing we're going to be working on in the future is a policy for sending teams over systematically to visit our missionaries, so that we advance this personal relationship, so we help on the field, so we see the field and bring that passion back to our own local church. Okay, so that's one of the things we felt we need to focus on. The Lord has given us is to recover local church responsibility for missionary activity. The second is exercising a focused approach. You know, I think we've been a little bit, what comes to us we'll evaluate in the past. Most churches are like that. Whatever opportunities come our way, then we'll evaluate. Well, we felt a real burden to Mary, yes, that, responding to what comes our way, but also being proactive and saying, where is there need in the world that God would have us focus on? Not a shotgun approach, but a focused approach. Something that's not just waiting back, but is proactive and is specialist. And so we asked the Lord about how to do that. One of those is not surprising at all. We need to reach our neighbors. We need to reach our neighbors. Clive and area is our fundamental responsibility. We begin there, and our efforts should demonstrate that this is our first priority, and then Central Alberta as a whole as well we can partner with. But these are our priorities. God has planted us here. He wants us to work here. That means we want to support evangelists and church plants when opportunities come up and we feel the Lord saying this is the one. And we're already working towards one of those right now in the Red Deer Dream Center, which helps with drug addictions by discipling people in Jesus Christ. It's an evangelistic outreach, and it's an in-home because they live together. Evangelistic outreach, and so that's one step. Acts of Mercy is another one. You know, we're fairly invested in that already as a church. We've got a local mission or a local needs budget policy where we spend X amount of dollars every year set aside to help the people that come to us that are in need. And so sometimes that's a really big project, sometimes that's a small project. But anything that we don't spend in that, we actually cut a check to our local family and community social services in Lacombe and make sure that that money gets out of our hands and gets into our community. The other thing we have, some of you will know this, is a Clive Benevolent Fund in the name of of Clive Baptist, we've partnered with our family and community social services to set up a benevolent fund for Clive itself, for our own village, so that when there's people in our community who are in need, they can come, and there's money reserved there that we've put in a bank account to be managed on our behalf to help them to reestablish themselves. And the other thing we feel we need to be mindful of is First Nations. We are blessed with reserves and reservations around us. We are so blessed with a diverse group of First Nations peoples in Alberta, and they are a rich resource of human meaning and culture. And you know, some of the things I think about that is that I believe God has planted in every single culture of the world special, unique things that are revealed about himself. The Christians recognized this among Greco-Romans in the initial period, even though they looked at Greco-Romans and said, yeah, they don't belong to Jesus, but Jesus has implanted something of reason, of philosophy that's beautiful, and of truth that advances once this Jewish completion of salvation comes in. They complement each other. They fit together. Justin Martyr referred to it as the seeds of the gospel were already planted there. You know, I experienced this with a Mohawk man back home who told me that in the generations before his own people were exposed to the gospel of Jesus Christ, they held to a myth about the Creator God and the Son that he would send to us. And this is actually universal throughout the world. I shouldn't say absolutely universal, but when we look at the gospel going into like Thailand and Burma, Myanmar, and those places, many of the tribes that accepted Jesus Christ, God had already spoken to. It was not a complete revelation. They were waiting for the complete revelation. And when missionaries appeared, they received it with eager hands because of God, what God had planted there. That happened here in Canada in our First Nations, our natives. It happened, and some of them recognized it immediately and some didn't. But there's a rich heritage there that the Lord has planted that's unique and we can glean from. My dream is that one day our reservations have grown in the gospel so much. Powerful, praying churches with their unique flavor that only God has shaped in them. That one day they are leading our culture back to Jesus Christ, leading our people, our diverse nations in Canada back to Jesus Christ. That's my dream. And I think that we should be considerate of First Nations in particular because they're often segregated from the general population. They may not have equal access to a strong church, and there are barriers in joining churches of other ethnic diversity because there are tensions, cultural tensions still, that it takes courage, real courage and gumption to overcome in order even to step foot in churches sometimes. And so we want to bless our brothers and sisters, and we want to see them grow in those places that some people look down upon. So that's in our own area. But we feel a goal, as Matthew 24 has told us, that all nations have to be discipled. There are groups in this world that have no access to the gospel, some that have very little. And I think it was, what's his name? Ralph Winter, a famous missiologist, put it this way: everyone's in need of the gospel, but not everyone is equally needy. And that is true. I want you to pause right now, and I want you to go to a website. In fact, you could just Google it, State of the World, the Task Remaining. And it'll take you to a website for Global Frontier Missions, and I want you to watch a 4-minute video on that website before we go on any further that'll give you an idea of what I'm talking about. Go ahead. Okay. So there is this category of people in the world representing about 2 billion people that are considered least reached and sometimes called unreached. They have virtually no access to the gospel of Jesus Christ. Is that hard to believe? I mean, we look at what's been accomplished of the task 2,000 years down the road, and I think we think that it's pretty much all done. And it's not. 2 billion people is a massive number who have very little access to the gospel of Jesus Christ. And it's within reach. Did you know that in the last, how many years has it been? I'm going to throw out 20 years, but I might be wrong in this. The number of translations of the Bible into people's primary language has doubled over the previous 2,000 years. We're in reach in our lifetime of seeing the Bible translated into every single language in the world. It's incredible. All we need is the workers. But this is true also for reaching nations that have never been reached before. Least reached groups are those groups that have limited access to the gospel without major cultural obstacles. One of the biggest ones is language. They don't have the gospel in their language. There is no strong church, or there aren't many churches in their language group. Or maybe it's caste that they have to overcome. The obstacle is no one will share the gospel with them because they're beneath. They're not seen by people, and no one's going to take the time for them. We want to target on these places. What was the figure? A minuscule amount of all of our efforts in the West is going to the most needy people in the world in terms of the gospel. And so that is where we feel God calling us. Hey, Clive Baptist Church, you have to become specialists in that, which is a daunting task because there's no way that I'm qualified to lead that, or our missions committee is qualified to lead that, or our church is qualified to lead that. There's a reason these are the least reached areas. They're hard. How can God use us if we just say, all right, I'm willing? Good grief. You're going to have to make me willing 1,000,000 more times, but help me. Now, one of the casualties of the fact that we want to be specialized in reaching least reached people groups is that we'll have to turn down opportunities that are perfectly good elsewhere. Someone wants to go to Russia. Well, Russia's got a large evangelical population. Not huge, but big enough they're not least reached. That's not where we feel called as a church. We'll bless you. We'll encourage private giving. We'll give you time to speak to our church to get private giving, but we feel led to give our attention to the least reached world. And we are hoping that over time, when somebody in our congregation says, I feel a call to global missions, I'm supposed to go overseas, they will have been exposed to the least reached people groups to such a degree that they say, and I'm supposed to go to the least reached. We are hoping to send our people there. Now, maybe God has other plans and we'll send them other places, in which case we can support them privately. And we're also going to remain faithful to the relationships we already have, like in Romania and so forth, where the gospel is pretty well established. We're not going to give those up. We're going to do this in addition to what is already there, what God has already established. But this is where we feel that we need to be reaching out as those don't have opportunity. It may be years before we can create our own ministries or send out our own agents. So what we want to do in this time is learn and have God teach us and partner with what already exists. And maybe that becomes something fruitful in the future. In fact, if it is from the Lord, it will. The final thing I want to say. Okay, so number one is reclaiming global missions as the local church's job. Number two is a focused approach instead of a shotgun approach, and that will include local and global to the least reached. The final is special projects in the coming years. Our church thrives when we're reaching for concrete goals. We seem to love it. It's just within reach. It's big, but it's just within reach. And every year, I think we can handle at least one major project to try and accomplish. This year, it's establishing the Red Deer Dream Center. As they are just in the building phase, we want to see them get to 100% funding for that. We want to see them built, and then we can talk about operating costs in the future. But our special project is to help that get on its feet. All right, well, that is a summary of how we respond to Matthew 28, Matthew 24, and what God wants to do with us outside our own walls. And there's a lot to flesh out in between here and there, but it gives us some direction. I'm going to ask you to close it with some time in prayer. I want you to pray into this for more and more vision of as a church, especially of the details. Okay, so we've got these big ideas. Now, God, how do we flesh it out? Pray as an individual for how God wants you to fit into our church's efforts, but also maybe on your own. And especially I want you to pray for those areas where right now we don't have a lot of structure of how to do it or a lot of details. How do we reach the least reached territories of the world? Nobody else has reached them before. Why should we be so brash to think we can? Well, because God can show us. God can lead us. And so we need to pray to God to do it. And secondly, to grow in evangelism and relationship in our own community beyond our doors. We really need to continue to grow in that. So pray to the Lord that He'll show us. I want you also to pray as we think about local churches. I want you to pray, regardless of what you think of the situation, but pray specifically for Grace Life Fellowship in Edmonton and Pastor James Coates, who's currently in prison. No matter what you think of the stand, where they've chosen to draw their line, and if you don't know about it, Google it. It won't take you any time. We need to be concerned about the local church and its health and the freedoms that the local church has. We need to care about those, even if we don't totally agree. We need to be in unity, even when we're not in uniformity. And we need to care about a human being instead of a political stance. So pray for that family, that individual, James Coates, and that church. And finally, continue to pray about this season that we're in, that God will rapidly move us beyond this COVID season, that He'd destroy this virus, and that He would bless His churches, especially with health, to continue in worship. And He has been. It's remarkable how the churches have been doing. And for our own community, that He'd guard our physical health. God bless. Thanks for being with us this morning, and take care.